The candles at the far end of the table had burned low enough that the shadows pooled between the silver and the crystal. And Lady Hesper Renfield Calloran sat very still while the conversation around her continued as though she were furniture. She had arrived in London that morning on estate business, a solicitor's appointment, a matter of signatures, and had accepted this dinner engagement before learning who else would be present. She had not announced herself to her husband when she took her seat, partly because the room was crowded and the introductions confused, and partly because, after 4 years of marriage, she had grown accustomed to his not noticing her. So she sat, and she listened, and she watched Lord Calloran at the other end of the polished mahogany table, talking too quickly to a man she recognized as his political rival, a man who had the small, persistent smile of someone who has been waiting all evening to use a particular weapon. The weapon, when it came, arrived wrapped in a compliment. "You must be proud," the rival said, lifting his glass, "of your wife's management of that Lincolnshire estate. Though I confess I've never met the woman. One begins to wonder whether she exists." The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when everyone understands that something is about to happen. Ambrose Calloran set down his fork. And then, with the clipped impatience of a man who has had one glass too many and one provocation too many, he said it. Said it to wound his rival, to end the needling, to perform the indifference he had long since made his armor. And the words landed on the room like something dropped from a great height. I never should have married her. The silence that followed was absolute. Hesper did not stand immediately. She reached into the small bag beside her chair and removed a folded document, and she set it on the table with the deliberateness of someone placing the final piece in a completed arrangement. Then she lifted her eyes to the far end of the table, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly steady, perfectly audible, and perfectly without heat. "Good news," she said. "You don't have to anymore." She watched him turn. She watched the moment he understood she was there. The precise instant his face changed, the way his hand moved toward his glass and then stopped, because there was nothing in reaching for a glass that would help him now. Around the table, no one breathed. The woman to Hesper's left had gone entirely rigid. The man to her right had set down his fork. Hesper pushed the document across the mahogany with 2 fingers. "The ecclesiastical court agreed 8 months ago," she said. "I came to London to give you the courtesy of your signature. I did not expect it to be necessary to give it to you here. But here we are." Ambrose Calloran's chair scraped back. He was on his feet without quite having decided to stand, and Hesper saw in the set of his jaw the struggle between the public man and whatever was happening underneath. The calculation, the damage assessment, the beginning of something that looked, from a distance, like the first crack in a very old wall. She rose. She reached behind her chair for her gloves, drawing them on with the unhurried precision of a woman who has nowhere urgent to be and knows it. The document lay on the table between them, and as she turned to go, Ambrose's hand moved. Not deliberately, but in the way hands move when the body acts before the mind gives permission, reaching across the wood toward her fingers. She had already withdrawn them. She walked the length of the room without looking back, and the door closed behind her with a sound no louder than a breath. And the quiet she left behind her was the loudest thing in London that night. To understand what Hesper Renfield had placed on that table, you must understand what the 4 years before it had cost her. She had come to the marriage at 34. Not young, not naive, not without a clear understanding of what arranged unions between ancient families required. The Renfield earldom had land and history and very little else. The Caloran Marquisate had the income to settle a centuries-old boundary dispute that had poisoned both families for 3 generations. The match was practical. Hesper had accepted it as such, but she had also, privately, believed that duty might become something warmer, given time and goodwill. And so she had approached the marriage with the quiet, steady effort she brought to everything. She had written to her husband every week, without fail, for the first 18 months. He had replied in those early months with letters that were polite and occasionally interesting, political observations, accounts of parliamentary business, the occasional dry remark about London society that suggested, if not warmth, at least a mind she could respect. Then, somewhere in the 19th month, the replies stopped. Hesper wrote for 6 months more before she permitted herself to understand that they had stopped for good. She did not weep. She did not write to him about it. She sat for one evening in the drawing room at Marrowdean with the last letter she had received. Dated, she noted, 3 days after a particularly successful speech in the Lords, when he had presumably been in excellent spirits. And she let herself feel, fully and without interruption, the specific grief of a hope she had been wrong to hold. Then she folded the letter away, and she got on with things. The things she got on with were considerable. The estate accounts, when she examined them properly, revealed a drainage problem in the South Fields that had been suppressing tenant yields for a decade. She commissioned the work, negotiated the contracts, and supervised the outcome herself. The roof of the East Wing had been documented as needing repair in an estate survey 3 years before her arrival. She arranged it before the autumn rains. She learned, through a conversation with the family solicitor she had never been formally introduced to, but sought out regardless, that Ambrose's younger sister had accumulated significant debts through a series of poor investments made on her behalf by a man who had since left England. Hesper settled them quietly from the income the Southfield improvements had generated, and she did not mention it to anyone. The village school was her own idea, funded from the estate accounts with a notation in the ledger that read simply, "Education, Village of Marrowdean, recurring." She had never discussed it with Ambrose because there had been no correspondence in which to discuss it. His late mother's portrait had hung in the east corridor in a condition of slow deterioration, the varnish darkened, the frame splitting at 2 corners. And Hesper had found, in the housekeeper's reminiscences, that the late Marchioness had been a woman of considerable warmth, who had hung the portrait herself in the position of honor above the great hall fireplace, and that Ambrose's father had moved it, after her death, to somewhere less visible, and that no one had moved it back. Hesper sent it to a restorer in York. She chose the frame herself. None of this appeared in any letter she sent him, because after the 24th month she had stopped sending letters. But she had kept copies of all 412 she had written in a locked drawer of the library writing desk, because she had understood, with the practical clarity that was her particular gift, that she might one day need them. She filed the ecclesiastical petition 8 months before the dinner, on a single legal ground: abandonment of correspondence and conjugal residence, documented across those 412 copied letters in her own hand. The court had reviewed them, had noted the dates and the cessation of replies, and had agreed. On the morning of the dinner, she had sat in a London solicitor's office and confirmed that the documents were in order. She had then proceeded to the engagement she had already accepted, before learning that Lord Caloran would be present, because she saw no reason why his attendance at a dinner should alter her plans. She had not expected to give him the papers across a dinner table in front of 20 witnesses. But she had, as always, adapted. 3 days after the dinner, the story had appeared in 3 London papers. 2 of them mentioned the document. One of them, with the particular relish of a publication that has been waiting for exactly this kind of story, noted that Lady Calloran had been described by multiple witnesses as entirely composed throughout. Ambrose arrived at Marrowdean without sending word ahead on a cold Tuesday morning, his traveling coat still damp from the road, his jaw set in the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say, and is less certain of it than he was when he started rehearsing. The butler received him at the front door with the precise, unhurried courtesy of a man who has been excellently trained. "My lord," he said, "we were not expecting you." "I didn't send word," Ambrose said. It was not quite an apology. "Quite so, my lord. Is her ladyship expecting you?" "She is not," Ambrose said flatly. "I see." The butler stepped back and held the door with perfect equanimity. "If you'll permit me, my lord, I'll ask whether her ladyship is available to receive you. In the meantime, may I show you to the small drawing room?" It was not the master's study. It was not the library. It was a pleasant, well-appointed room at the side of the house that Ambrose did not immediately recognize, which told him something he was not yet ready to examine about how long it had been since he had spent time at Marrowdean. He waited. The room was not what he had expected. He had expected, he realized, something in a state of genteel neglect, the slow dissolution of a household without active management. Instead, the fire was clean and well laid, the windows unfogged. The writing desk in the corner occupied by a surveying map he did not recognize, spread open and annotated in a hand he did not know. A ledger lay open beside it, the columns filled with figures in a neat, economical script. A jar of ink sat at the corner of the desk, the rim still dark and wet. He picked up the map, set it down. He walked to the window and looked at the south fields, which were, he had not noticed before, considerably more productive looking than he remembered. He walked back to the desk and looked at the ledger without reading it, because reading it felt like a trespass he had not been invited to commit. He had been waiting 20 minutes when the door opened. Hesper Calloran came in from outside, still in her riding clothes, mud on her boots to the ankle, a second ledger tucked under her left arm, and a folded letter in her right hand. She did not apologize for keeping him waiting. She did not ask what he wanted. She crossed to the writing desk, set the letter down, opened the ledger, and then she sat and looked at him with the calm, level attention of a woman who has an estate to run, and a finite amount of mourning in which to run it. "Lord Calloran," she said, "how can I help you?" He had intended to be magnanimous. He had prepared on the road from London a version of himself that was measured, reasonable, appropriately contrite without being theatrical. A man who understood the situation and intended to handle it with dignity. He began with the estate accounts. "I thought it appropriate," he said, "to review the accounts while the dissolution is being finalized. Take stock of things. I can take some of the burden off your hands." Hesper opened the ledger. "The drainage work in the South Fields was completed 18 months ago," she said. "The yield increase has been approximately 1/3 over the pre-improvement average. You'll see the figures on page 4. Ambrose looked at page 4. "The roof repairs to the east wing were completed in October of last year, before the autumn rains," Hesper continued, "which prevented approximately 400 pounds of water damage to the eastern corridor and the rooms above it. Page 7 covers the contractor costs and the materials." "I wasn't aware," Ambrose began. "Page 12, Hesper said, "covers the settlement of the outstanding debt held against your sister by her late investment advisor's firm. That was cleared 18 months ago from the Southfield income." There was a pause. "My sister had debts?" Ambrose said. "She did. She doesn't now." Hesper turned a page. I should note that I did not inform her of the source of the settlement. I thought it more dignified for her to believe the firm had reviewed the matter and found it unenforceable. If you would prefer I tell her otherwise, I'm happy to do so. Ambrose was on his feet. He had not intended to stand, but he was standing. And the map on the writing desk was suddenly extremely interesting to look at because it required him to look at something that was not her face. "You should have told me," he said. "About the debts, about all of it. You should have written to me." The pause that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "I wrote you 412 letters," Hesper said. She said it with the same tone she had used for the drainage figures, precise, unhurried, factual. She reached beneath the ledger and placed on the table between them a bound stack of papers. Thick enough that the binding strained at the spine. She did not open it. "I kept copies," she said. "The court required documentation. They are arranged by date. The earliest is from the 7th week of our marriage." Ambrose looked at the stack of papers. He did not touch it. "I didn't," he began. "I know you didn't," Hesper said. "That is what the court found." She closed the ledger and stood, and the matter of the accounts, it appeared, was settled. He asked to walk the estate. It was not quite a question, but Hesper answered it as one. "Of course," she said, and she picked up the ledger and led the way out. She walked him through it, as she would walk any interested party through a property she was responsible for, noting the drainage channels, the repaired fencing along the east boundary, the improved access road to the North Tenant Farms. She pointed out each improvement with the same even delivery she had used in the drawing room. And once, when he paused to look back at the house from the upper field, she said, in a tone that was more observational than unkind, "You'll notice the east wing is distinguishable now from the main structure. It wasn't before the restoration work. The stonework had deteriorated to the point where the two blended." She paused. "It is essentially a property inspection for a stranger, which I suppose is what this is." He did not answer. He looked at the east wing for a moment and then walked on. In the great hall, he stopped. His mother's portrait hung above the fireplace in the position of prominence it had not occupied since his father's time. Cleaned, reframed, the colors returned to what they must have been when she sat for it. She looked younger than he remembered her. She looked, he thought, like someone who had expected to be happy and had not yet learned that she wouldn't be. He stood there long enough that Hesper stopped walking and waited. He did not speak about it. He could not have said in that moment what words would have been adequate, and so he said nothing, and after a time he turned away, and they walked on toward the east wing. The restoration work was 3/4 complete, new plasterwork in the corridor, the window frames rebuilt, the floors relaid where the damp had got beneath them. It smelled of lime and fresh timber and the particular clean cold of a room that has been recently opened to air. Hesper was explaining the timeline for the remaining work when the storm broke. It came in fast from the west, the way autumn storms came in across the Lincolnshire plain. No gradual darkening, just a sudden percussion of rain against the tall windows and a crack of wind that took the old oak outside the east corridor by surprise. The first branch struck the window frame. The second, heavier branch swung from the split trunk directly toward the open casement. Ambrose moved before he thought about it. He stepped between Hesper and the window, his back to the glass, his arms out at his sides, not reaching for her, not touching her, simply interposing himself between her and whatever was coming through. The branch missed. It struck the stone of the window surround and fell into the courtyard below. And the rain came in through the open casement in a cold horizontal sheet. And they stood there for a moment in the aftermath of it. "Thank you," Hesper said. Her voice was steady, as it always was. She stepped around him, reached past his arm to the casement, and drew it shut herself. They walked back to the house in the rain without speaking. The mud on her boots was now joined by mud on his, and water darkened the shoulders of his coat, and neither of them remarked on any of it. That evening, Hesper left the library unlocked. She did not tell him she had done so. She simply did not lock the drawer in the writing desk before she went upstairs, and she left the lamp burning low on the table, and she went to bed. Ambrose found the library at 9:30, drawn by the lamp or by the same restlessness that had been driving him from room to room since they returned from the walk. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the writing desk, and then he crossed the room and opened the drawer. The letters were arranged in bundles by date, tied with plain linen cord. He took out the first bundle and sat down in the chair by the writing desk. He read the first letter, which was dated 6 weeks after their wedding and described in careful, intelligent detail the first estate accounts meeting she had attended on his behalf, the questions she had asked, the answers she had received, and her preliminary observations about the Southfield drainage problem. It was the letter of a woman who was paying attention and expected, eventually, to be heard. He read the second letter, and the third. At some point he moved from the chair to the floor, sitting with his back against the desk and the bundles arranged around him, because the chair had begun to feel insufficient for what he was doing. He did not light a second candle when the first burned down, and continued reading by the firelight, because stopping to find a candle felt like an interruption he was not willing to make. The letters were not what he had braced himself for. He had expected accusation, or grief, or the slow accumulation of reproach. What he found instead was a record of a life, specific, attentive, and entirely real. She wrote about the tenants by name. She wrote about the village school she was planning, the costs, the arguments she had made to the local committee, the morning she had stood in the empty lot where the building would go and tried to imagine what it would look like, full of children. She wrote about his sister's debts in a single, careful paragraph that contained no judgment of him for not knowing, and no pride in her own handling of them. She wrote about the portrait restorer in York, what the man had said about the original pigments, how long the work would take, where she intended to rehang it. He read straight through the night, bundle by bundle, and did not stop. The last letter was dated 14 months ago. It was shorter than the others, a single page written in the evening, in a hand that was slightly less controlled than usual, as though written quickly or in poor light. It described a conversation with a child from the village, who had come to ask whether the lord of the manor would be attending the harvest festival that year. Hesper wrote that she had told the child yes. She wrote that she had then sat with that lie for the rest of the afternoon, unable to determine whether it was kinder to the child or to herself, and that she had concluded, finally, that it was neither, and that she would not make it again. The letter ended there. There was no closing sentiment, just the date and her signature, and then nothing. The stillness of a drawer that had held these pages for 14 months without being opened. Ambrose sat on the floor of the library with the last letter in his hands for a long time after the clock struck 4. The fire had burned to embers. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the world held the particular quiet of early morning before anything has begun. He did not move when the library door opened at first light. He heard it, the quiet turn of the handle, the soft hinge, and he knew, without looking up, that it was Hesper. He heard her stop. He heard, in the quality of the stillness that followed, the moment she understood what she was seeing. Then the door closed again, as quietly as it had opened, and she was gone. Over the 3 days that followed, Ambrose made his offers. He presented them formally, one at a time, in the small drawing room where she continued to receive him with the same composed attention she brought to the estate accounts meetings. "I intend to instruct my solicitor to transfer the estate to your name outright," he said on the first morning. "Not as part of the dissolution settlement, above and beyond it. The estate is yours. It has been yours in every practical sense for 2 years." Hesper looked up from the letter she was reading. "The estate is already generating the income I require," she said. "A formal transfer at this stage would trigger a review of the entail that would take the better part of a year and accomplish nothing the dissolution papers haven't already accomplished. I appreciate the intention." He tried again the following afternoon. "I'll return to London immediately," he said. "My presence here is... I understand that it's not easy, and I have no right to. Your departure would not change the status of the dissolution papers," Hesper said. "They require your signature, which you can provide here or in London with equal effect. There is no practical reason for you to leave on my account." On the third morning, he came in with the name of his London solicitor and an offer to have the man draw up a guaranteed income arrangement independent of any future change in Ambrose's own financial circumstances. Hesper set down her pen. "I have my own solicitor," she said. "He is, by any measure, extremely competent. He is the one who filed the ecclesiastical petition." She looked at Ambrose for a moment. "You're trying to do the right thing," she said. "I understand that. But the right thing, in each case you've described, is something I have already done for myself. I don't need you to do it for me. And I don't think it would make you feel better, even if I let you." He had no answer to that. He stood in the middle of the small drawing room, and the quiet settled around him. And for the first time in 4 days, he had nothing left to offer and no formal posture to retreat to. He was still standing there when the knock came at the front door, not the butler's measured footfall, but a rapid, urgent knock that brought the housekeeper at a near run. The message was from the village. The young daughter of the schoolmaster's assistant had developed a fever that had not broken in 2 days, and the nearest physician was 12 miles out along the Grantham Road, and the child was not improving. Hesper read the note aloud. She had not finished the last sentence when Ambrose walked past her, out of the drawing room and down the hall and through the door to the stable yard. She heard him speaking to the groom, quick, specific, the name of the physician, the road, the horse, and then the sound of hooves on the cobblestones, moving fast and then nothing. She stood in the doorway of the drawing room for a moment, the note still in her hand. He came back at dawn. She heard the horses at the gate and came downstairs still in her dressing gown. And she opened the front door to find him standing on the step. Soaked through to the skin, his coat dark with rain, his hair flattened against his forehead, mud to the knee, and behind him, dismounting at the gate, the physician from the Grantham Road. Ambrose did not speak. He looked at her, and something in his face had shifted in the night, not broken exactly, but altered, the way a lock looks after the key has finally turned. He stepped toward her, and she did not step back, and he leaned his forehead against hers, eyes closed, and stood there. They stood like that for the length of a breath, or perhaps 2, until the physician's horse came through the gate with the clatter of iron on wet stone, and they separated. And Hesper directed the physician inside, and the morning began. After the fever night, something changed in how Ambrose moved through Marrowdean. He stopped making offers. He stopped arriving at the small drawing room with prepared speeches and formal gestures. Instead, he simply appeared in the places where the estate's work was happening, and he made himself useful without claiming authority over any of it. He was in the stable at 6 on Thursday morning when the farrier came, and he held the mare's head and passed the tools without being asked, and he learned the farrier's name, Thomas Birch, who had been shoeing Marrowdean horses for 11 years, by the simple method of asking him. He sat across from Hesper's estate manager at the weekly accounts meeting on Friday, in the chair that was not at the head of the table, and he listened and asked questions and did not suggest corrections. He learned the names of the tenant farmers by asking the housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, privately, over a cup of tea in the servants' hall on the Saturday morning. And Mrs. Alderton, who had been at Marrowdean for 19 years and was not a woman who gave her warmth carelessly, told him the names and the family histories and the particular difficulties of each holding, and he listened to all of it. On Sunday afternoon, Hesper was on the upper step-ladder in the library, reaching for a bound volume on the highest shelf, a land survey from 1743 that she needed for a boundary question the estate manager had raised. The book was 2 inches beyond her reach, and she was stretching for it when Ambrose passed the open door. He came in without being invited. He crossed the room to the base of the ladder and reached up and steadied her elbow with one hand, not gripping, just present. A point of contact that kept the ladder from swaying as she stretched. She reached the book. She came down 3 rungs before she stepped off the ladder, and for the 2 seconds it took her to descend those rungs, his hand remained at her elbow. And she was aware of every one of those seconds in the way you are aware of something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. Neither of them said anything about it. In the estate garden that afternoon, Hesper found herself standing beside Mrs. Alderton at the kitchen garden wall, watching the last of the autumn roses, and she said, not planning to say it, simply finding it in her mouth when she opened it, "I don't know whether I'm willing to choose a marriage, any marriage. I thought I did know, and now I find that I don't." Mrs. Alderton, who had seen a great deal in 19 years, looked at the roses for a moment before she answered. "You don't have to know today, my lady," she said. 2 days later, Hesper learned from the schoolmaster that Lord Calloran had visited the village school on Monday morning, had come alone without telling her, had sat in the back of the classroom for an hour, had spoken with the teacher about the curriculum, and had left a donation for new reading primers. The child with the fever, the schoolmaster reported, had recovered. She was back in her seat in the 3rd row. Hesper stood in the doorway of the school after the schoolmaster had gone back inside, looking at the building she had funded and built and never shown to her husband. And she stood there for a while, without thinking about anything in particular. The solicitor arrived from London on a Wednesday morning with a leather case, and the brisk, careful manner of a man who has been given specific instructions and intends to follow them precisely. Ambrose received him in the estate study, the master's study, which he had been using since the 3rd day of his stay, because Hesper had told him without ceremony that the room was his and she had never used it herself. The papers were spread on the desk. The solicitor reviewed them, confirmed the particulars, and Ambrose signed them with witnesses present. The solicitor, the estate manager, and Mrs. Alderton, who had been asked to attend and whose expression throughout the proceedings was entirely unreadable. Hesper was not asked to be there. Ambrose had not asked her. When the solicitor had gone, Ambrose sat alone in the study for a time. Then he picked up the executed documents, folded them into their envelope, and walked out of the house. The chapel was at the eastern edge of the estate grounds, a small stone building that had served the Calloran family for 2 centuries and was still used for the village services twice monthly. Ambrose and Hesper had been married there 4 years ago on a cold March morning, with 12 witnesses and a breakfast afterward in the great hall that neither of them had arranged. He sent word to the house that he had something to give her, and that he would be in the chapel if she wished to come. She came alone, on foot, across the wet grass. He was standing in the doorway when she arrived, not inside, not outside, simply in the threshold, holding the envelope. He held it out to her when she stopped in front of him. She took it. She opened it, looked at the pages, understood what she was holding. The marriage was dissolved. The seal was affixed. It was done. She folded the papers and held them at her side and looked at him. Ambrose was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want to be clear before I ask it that the answer may be no, and that no would be a just answer. I would not argue with it." Hesper waited. "I would like to court you," he said. "From the beginning. Not as your husband. I am not your husband anymore. And I have no claim on you from that history, and I don't intend to use it as one. As a stranger who would like the chance, over whatever time you require, to become someone you might one day choose to have in your life." He paused. "I understand what I did. Not the version I told myself for 4 years. The version where I was being honest about what I felt by keeping my distance. I understand now what it actually was, and what it cost you. And I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking only for the chance to be different, if you will allow it." Hesper looked at him for a long time. The space between them stretched out, and in that space Ambrose heard, very clearly, the possibility of no, not as an abstraction, but as a specific, concrete outcome. Her walking back across the wet grass with the papers in her hand and a life ahead of her that was entirely her own and did not include him. He heard it and he held it, and he did not speak to fill the space. "The estate," Hesper said at last, "remains in my name. As a settled jointure, permanent, regardless of what follows between us. That is not a condition of courtship. It is simply a fact." He answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Any courtship proceeds on my schedule," she said, "and by my invitation. You do not arrive uninvited. You do not make decisions about what I need or how to provide it. You ask." He met her eyes. "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped toward him, not he toward her, but she toward him, closing the distance herself, and she kissed him once, briefly, in the chapel doorway, where they had stood 4 years ago, and promised things neither of them had understood how to keep. The kiss was not long, and it was not tentative. And when she stepped back, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in the neighborhood of one. The look of a woman who has made a decision she has thought through carefully and finds, on reflection, that she stands behind it. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "Send word first." She walked back to the house across the wet grass, the dissolution papers under her arm, and she did not look back, and Ambrose stood in the chapel doorway and watched her go. That evening, in the room he had taken at the village inn, because he had understood, without being told, that the house at Marrowdean was not where he should sleep that night. Ambrose sat at the writing desk for a long time before he picked up the pen. He had never written her a letter. In 4 years of marriage, across 412 letters she had written to him, he had replied perhaps 20 times, and not at all in the last 2.5 years. He sat with that fact for a moment, not as a cause for self-recrimination, which would have been self-indulgent and beside the point, but simply as information about the distance between where he had been and where he was now. He picked up the pen and he wrote. He wrote about the south fields, which he had walked again that afternoon after leaving the chapel, and what they looked like in the late autumn light. The particular quality of the drained land, the way the soil lay differently from the untreated fields to the north, the evidence of work that had changed something real in the ground. He wrote about the schoolmaster, whom he had spoken with again on the way back from the chapel, and what the man had said about the reading primers, that the children were already through the first set and would need a second before Christmas. He wrote about the portrait in the great hall, and what it had been to see his mother's face returned to a version of herself he had almost forgotten, and that he intended to write to the restorer in York to thank him, and that he thought his mother would have liked Hesper, which was a thing he had not permitted himself to think before, and found, now that he had, that he believed it completely. He wrote for an hour. He sealed the letter and gave it to the innkeeper's boy to carry to the house. Hesper received it at 9 o'clock at the library table by candlelight. She broke the seal and unfolded the pages and read them slowly, from the first line to the last. While the candle burned and the house settled into its evening quiet around her, she read to the end. She set the letter down on the table in front of her. Outside, the wind moved through the old oak in the courtyard, the one that had lost a branch in the storm, and the sound of it came faintly through the tall windows, a sound she had lived with for 4 years and knew as well as her own breathing. Lady Hesper Renfield Calloran sat in the library she had built, in the house she had restored, in the life she had made for herself out of patience, and 412 letters no one had read, and she smiled.